A crisp autumn breeze swept through Willow Creek Park as Naomi Carter quietly sipped her coffee, unaware that her life was about to turn into a national spectacle. A casual afternoon break turned chaotic when a sharp-tongued woman decided Naomi, simply minding her own business, didn't belong there. Accusations flew, police were called, and a heated confrontation revealed the ugly face of everyday racism. Little did that woman know, the calm and composed Naomi had a powerful secret that would not only turn the courtroom upside down but bring devastating consequences for her accuser. Brace yourself. This story is about to expose the truth and serve up karmic justice. Willow Creek Park, just outside downtown Chicago, was known for its gentle slopes, manicured lawns, and the old oak trees that provided dappled shade on warm afternoons. Families came here with their children to play on the swings, joggers took advantage of the scenic trails, and college students stretched out on blankets to study. On this particular day, Naomi Carter, a 26-year-old graduate of Columbia University, sat by herself at a sturdy wooden picnic table near the newly built playground. She was dressed in simple workout gear, black leggings, a gray sweatshirt, and sipped a latte from the nearby Starbucks on Michigan Avenue. She'd come here to enjoy some fresh air and de-stress from a hectic few weeks. The sunlight glinted off her small silver earrings as she pulled out a notebook. She liked to journal her thoughts. Writing had always been her way of staying grounded. Naomi felt a small pang of homesickness for New York City, where she'd spent her college years. She remembered the hustle and bustle of the city, the monuments lit up at night, and the vibrant neighborhoods that felt like home. But her work had brought her to Chicago, and she was determined to make the best of it. She was so engrossed in writing that she almost didn't notice a woman standing a few feet away. The woman had short, perfectly coiffed blonde hair, wore a pastel sweater draped over her shoulders, and clutched her designer handbag. Her expression was a mix of fear and indignation. Naomi looked up and gave her a polite smile, but the woman's scowl only deepened. "Can I help you with something?" Naomi asked, unsure if the woman needed directions or help. Sometimes, Naomi recalled, strangers approached her for small talk or to ask about the local area. Perhaps this was just a confused tourist. The woman's gaze raked over Naomi. "I'm Karen Whitmore," she said curtly. "Are you supposed to be here?" Naomi blinked. "Excuse me." She placed her notebook down. "It's a public park, ma'am. I come here often." Karen's lips pinched. "Well, you don't look like you're from around here. I was just making sure everything is in order." The saccharine note in her voice couldn't hide the underlying hostility. Naomi felt her heart tighten in annoyance. She had seen this kind of behavior before, sometimes subtle, sometimes overt. A part of her wanted to roll her eyes and walk away, but another part told her to remain calm. She closed her notebook gently and inhaled, centering herself before responding. "Yes, I'm allowed to be here. Everyone is." Karen pursed her lips again, looking around as if searching for a park official or some sign that Naomi was breaking the rules. "I just find it suspicious, you sitting here with that big bag. We've had issues with certain people causing trouble. If you don't mind, I'd like to see some identification." Naomi suppressed a disbelieving laugh. "Identification? That's not necessary. I'm just an ordinary citizen like you, enjoying my day." She deliberately kept her tone even, though irritation was creeping into her veins. Karen's voice sharpened. "Listen, young lady, I have every right to be concerned about suspicious activity. I know the local authorities personally. This is a very safe neighborhood, and we like to keep it that way." Naomi glanced around. A few other park visitors had started to notice the tension. She saw a mother pulling her child closer, uncertain whether she should intervene or walk away. Naomi sighed, realizing this was about to turn into one of those moments she'd read about on social media, where someone assumed a black person was up to no good just for existing in a space. Staying cool, Naomi grabbed her latte. "Well, if you feel unsafe, you're free to leave." Karen's cheeks reddened. "How dare you speak to me like that?" A swirl of emotion coursed through Naomi, anger, exhaustion, the heaviness that comes from dealing with bias. But Naomi remained calm. She stood up slowly, adjusting her sweatshirt, and said, "I'm not causing you any trouble. Please let me enjoy my day in peace." Karen's eyes narrowed. "We'll see what the authorities have to say." Her trembling hand reached inside her handbag, and she pulled out her cell phone. Right away, she began dialing. Naomi felt a tremor of frustration course through her. It was happening again, the same old storyline. A concerned person deciding that her presence was grounds for calling the police. Naomi knew this could escalate if she didn't remain composed. Yet she refused to shrink away. "Yes, hello." Karen spoke into her phone, stepping a few paces away. I'm at Willow Creek Park. There's a suspicious person here. Won't show ID. Could be a threat. The worst part wasn't even the phone call itself. It was the calm conviction in Karen's voice. The sense of entitlement. Naomi ground her teeth in frustration, reminding herself that she needed to handle this with dignity. And so, she waited, a heart pounding, but resolve solid. The police were on their way. That much was certain. The day that was supposed to be a peaceful break was now morphing into Naomi's worst nightmare. Little did Karen know that Naomi was far from an easy target. She had resources, allies, and something in her back pocket that would stun them all. As Karen stood off to the side, waiting for the police to pick up her call, Naomi's mind raced. She had spent the last 2 years working undercover for the Central Intelligence Agency, assigned to a specialized track focusing on domestic and international threats. Fresh out of Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs, Naomi had been recruited for her analytical brilliance and uncanny ability to diffuse tense situations. Yet, at this moment, ironically, Naomi felt powerless in the face of Karen's brazen attempt to keep the neighborhood safe. She could, of course, flash her CIA credentials right then and there. But Naomi was off duty, and publicly brandishing her badge was not only against policy, it could compromise her operational safety. Usually, only law enforcement had reason to show ID in public settings, and Naomi had strict instructions never to reveal her status unless absolutely necessary. Still, Naomi couldn't quell the burning anger inside. Was this truly the same America where she was proud to serve her country? The same place where she risked her own comfort to protect national security? The hatred and bigotry Karen displayed was nothing new. But each incident cut deeper. Naomi's father, a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps, had warned her that the world wasn't always fair, and that wearing the CIA badge wouldn't immunize her from prejudice. He was painfully correct. Meanwhile, Karen rambled on the phone, describing Naomi with exaggerated claims. "She's acting aggressive," Karen said. "I feel threatened." Naomi could hear Karen's voice tremble, with a practiced fear. Naomi rolled her eyes. She was still standing a good 10 feet away, arms at her sides, making no move to approach Karen. A wave of helpless fury coursed through Naomi. But she held herself in check, because soon, justice would be served. The minutes dragged on as Naomi Carter remained standing by the picnic table, hands steady, her breathing controlled. She had dealt with worse situations before: espionage, high-risk negotiations, real threats to national security. And yet, the routine prejudice she faced in her own country always struck a deeper, more personal nerve. A police cruiser pulled into the circular driveway of Willow Creek Park, its flashing lights cutting through the autumn air. The tension around them thickened. A few bystanders had gathered, sensing the drama unfolding before them. Some whispered, others filmed from a distance. 2 officers stepped out of the vehicle, a tall, graying man and a petite woman with her hair pulled into a tight bun. Naomi immediately recognized their type, officers trying to assess a situation before it spiraled. Whether they'd approach with fairness or bias was still unknown. Karen Whitmore wasted no time rushing toward them. "Oh, thank goodness you're here," she exclaimed, her voice laced with manufactured distress. She pointed a manicured finger at Naomi. "That woman over there is refusing to leave, and I feel threatened. She won't show ID. She looks like she might be carrying something dangerous in that bag." Naomi watched as the officers exchanged a look. The male officer, Sergeant Harris, turned toward Naomi. "Ma'am, can you explain what's going on here?" Before Naomi could speak, Karen interrupted. She refused to identify herself when I asked. She was sitting alone, acting suspicious. "I have children who play here." Naomi glanced around the park, noting that not a single child stood behind Karen. The woman's ruse was unraveling quickly, but Naomi knew how these stories often played out. The loudest voice sometimes won by sheer force of conviction. She took a steadying breath, her training kicking in. "Stay calm. Stay composed. I'm happy to answer your questions," Naomi said, her voice even. "But first, I'd appreciate if you heard me out." She carefully placed her latte on the table and met the officer's eyes. "I was here writing, minding my own business. She approached me, demanded ID, and then called you. That's all there is to it." The officers turned to Karen. "Miss Whitmore," Officer Patel, the female officer, said, "do you have any reason to believe Miss Carter is committing a crime?" Karen's cheeks flushed. "She refused to show me ID. Doesn't that count for anything?" She was sitting alone and looking suspicious. "I felt threatened." Sergeant Harris exhaled through his nose, visibly weary. "It's not a crime to sit in a public park. And it's certainly not a requirement to show identification to a private citizen. Karen's mouth opened and closed as if searching for a rebuttal. She clenched the strap of her handbag tighter. Naomi crossed her arms, watching as the officers subtly shifted their body language. The tide was turning. Officer Patel handed Naomi back her ID after a brief glance. "Everything checks out. You're free to continue your day, ma'am." Karen sputtered in frustration. "So that's it? She just gets to stay?" Sergeant Harris frowned. "Miss Whitmore, you're both allowed to be here. If you're uncomfortable, you may leave." Naomi saw the moment Karen realized she had lost this round. Her expression darkened, her fingers twitching around her phone. But she wasn't done. With one last venomous glare at Naomi, Karen hissed, "This isn't over." Then, she spun on her heel and stormed away. Naomi exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. The officers gave her a nod before returning to their cruiser. The small crowd that had gathered began to disperse. A teenage boy who had been filming the interaction on his phone approached Naomi. "That was crazy," he muttered. "I got most of that on video if you need it." Naomi smiled, touched by his willingness to help. "Thanks. What's your name?" "Jamal," he said. She nodded, slipping him her number. "Let's keep in touch. Just in case." As Jamal skated away, Naomi took a deep breath and reclaimed her seat at the picnic table. She had won today's battle. But she had a feeling Karen Whitmore wasn't going to let this go. For a few days, life seemed to return to normal. Naomi continued her routine, working out at her favorite gym, grabbing coffee from her usual cafe, and tending to her highly classified duties at the CIA's Chicago field office. Officially, she worked as a data analyst for a private consulting firm. Unofficially, she was deeply embedded in the intelligence community, focusing on domestic threats to national security. But something felt off. One evening, while walking home from the grocery store, she noticed a silver sedan parked across the street. The engine idled, and the windows were tinted too dark to see inside. A chill ran up her spine. Was that Karen's car? She wasn't sure, but something told her she was being watched. Later that night, her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Hello? Naomi? It's Jamal. From the park." Relief washed over her. "Hey, Jamal. What's up?" He hesitated. "That lady from the park, Karen? She was at the skate park today. She was showing people a picture of you, asking if anyone knew where you lived. She was saying you were dangerous." Naomi felt a surge of cold anger. "She has my picture?" "Yeah. Looks like a screenshot from the video." Her jaw clenched. Karen wasn't just angry. She was actively trying to stir up trouble, painting Naomi as a public menace. Naomi had dealt with extremists before. She had studied the psychology of radicalization, had infiltrated groups that thrived on misinformation. But she never expected to find herself the target of such tactics. She thanked Jamal and ended the call, her mind racing. Karen had threatened, "This isn't over." And she had meant it. A week later, Naomi woke up to an email from a law firm. The subject line made her stomach tighten. Notice of civil complaint, Whitmore versus Carter. She opened it and scanned the contents in disbelief. Karen Whitmore was suing her for emotional distress, defamation, and threatening behavior. Naomi sat back, stunned. Karen was claiming she had been the victim. The lawsuit alleged that Naomi had deliberately and maliciously caused Karen to fear for her safety, and that Naomi had spread falsehoods that damaged Karen's immaculate reputation. Naomi felt heat rise in her cheeks. This was beyond outrageous. Karen wasn't just trying to harass her, she was trying to ruin her. But Karen had underestimated Naomi. Naomi had been trained to anticipate threats, to strategize, to outmaneuver her opponents. If Karen wanted a fight, Naomi would be ready. She picked up her phone and dialed a lawyer recommended by a friend. After a few rings, a calm voice answered. "Law Office of Penelope Garcia. How may I help you?" Naomi took a deep breath. "I need to schedule a consultation. I'm being sued, and I intend to fight back." Little did Karen know, Naomi had an ace up her sleeve. And when the truth came out in court, Karen Whitmore would be left speechless. The day of the first court hearing arrived under an overcast Chicago sky. The city's towering skyline loomed in the background as Naomi Carter stepped out of a black sedan in front of the downtown courthouse. Cameras flashed the moment she emerged, and a handful of reporters whispered excitedly as they jotted notes on their pads. Naomi kept her head high, her expression unreadable. She had faced much worse than a courtroom, had infiltrated high-stakes situations where one wrong move meant death. And yet, the thought of standing trial over a baseless lawsuit filed by a privileged, entitled woman filled her with a different kind of anxiety. By the courthouse entrance, she spotted Karen Whitmore standing with her lawyer, Clay Harrison. Karen's hair was pulled into a severe bun, her crisp white blouse meticulously ironed. Her smug expression sent a wave of irritation through Naomi, but she tamped it down. Naomi's own attorney, Penelope Garcia, met her at the steps. "Ready?" Penelope asked, giving Naomi a reassuring glance. "As I'll ever be," Naomi murmured. Inside, the courtroom was a blend of darkwood and cold professionalism. A few onlookers filled the public benches, some were likely community members curious about the case, while others were press. Naomi took her seat at the defendant's table while Karen and Clay settled into the plaintiff's side. Judge Amelia Brooks, a sharp-eyed woman with decades of legal experience, entered and called the court to order. Everyone rose, then sat back down. Case number 26789, Whitmore v. Carter, the judge announced, flipping through the case files. "Plaintiff, you may proceed with your opening statement." Clay Harrison stood, smoothing his suit jacket before addressing the jury. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about fear, intimidation, and defamation. My client, Karen Whitmore, a respected member of this community, was subjected to an aggressive and threatening encounter that left her fearing for her safety. After the incident, the defendant, Naomi Carter, took it upon herself to tarnish my client's reputation, spreading falsehoods that led to emotional distress and irreparable damage to her good name. Today, we seek justice." Naomi's hands tightened into fists beneath the table. The audacity. Penelope stood next, her voice cool and measured. "Your Honor, this case is not about fear or intimidation. It is about power and prejudice. My client, Naomi Carter, was minding her own business in a public park, a space where she had every right to be. She was approached, harassed, and falsely accused of suspicious behavior without cause. The plaintiff then escalated the situation, calling the police without any reasonable justification. And now, in an attempt to cover her tracks, she is suing my client on unfounded claims of defamation. We will present evidence that Ms. Whitmore's lawsuit is not only baseless but a blatant attempt to weaponize the legal system against an innocent woman." Karen's face twitched as Penelope spoke. Naomi exhaled, steadying herself. The trial had officially begun. The first few testimonies came from Karen's friends, women from her social circle who parroted her version of events. They claimed Karen had been terrified and just trying to ensure the safety of the community. But under cross-examination, Penelope easily picked their testimonies apart. "Were you present at the park when the initial interaction occurred?" Penelope asked one woman, an older lady named Marjorie. "Well, no, but Karen told me everything." "So, you didn't actually witness Miss Carter threatening or harassing Miss Whitmore?" Marjorie hesitated. "Not personally, no." "Thank you," Penelope said, turning back to her notes. One by one, Karen's witnesses folded under Penelope's sharp questioning, exposing the holes in Karen's case. Then it was Naomi's turn. She took the stand, keeping her expression calm. Penelope guided her through the details of the day, how she had simply been journaling in the park, how Karen had approached her demanding ID, how she had called the police. "Did you ever threaten Miss Whitmore?" Penelope asked. "No," Naomi said firmly. "Did you ever call her a racist or spread malicious rumors about her in the community?" "No. I simply told the truth when people asked what happened." Clay Harrison stood, preparing for his cross-examination. "Miss Carter," he said smoothly, "do you have a background in any specialized training?" Naomi's pulse quickened. She had anticipated this. "I attended Columbia University, where I studied international relations," she said neutrally. Clay tilted his head. "Is that all? Or do you also have experience working with, let's say, law enforcement?" Penelope objected. "Relevance, Your Honor?" Judge Brooks considered. "I'll allow a limited response. Proceed carefully, Mr. Harrison." Clay turned back to Naomi. "Are you now, or have you ever been, affiliated with a government agency that provides you with specialized training?" Naomi exhaled slowly. It was time. "Yes," she said, her voice unwavering. "I am a federal employee." The room seemed to still. "And what agency do you work for, Miss Carter?" Naomi sat up straighter, her eyes locking with Karen's. "I am an intelligence officer for the Central Intelligence Agency." A collective gasp rippled through the spectators. Even the judge's brow lifted slightly. Karen's face drained of color. Clay hesitated, clearly thrown. "The CIA?" Naomi nodded. "Yes." Clay forced a smile. "That's quite the claim. Do you have proof?" Without a word, Naomi reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and pulled out a small, black leather case. She flipped it open, revealing her official CIA badge and credentials. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Karen's face was frozen in shock. Judge Brooks signaled for Naomi's credentials to be entered into the record under seal due to their sensitive nature. Penelope stood. "Your Honor, Miss Carter's position as a federal intelligence officer only further disproves the plaintiff's claim that she is a threat. Intelligence officers are trained to de-escalate situations, not instigate them. Furthermore, this demonstrates that Miss Carter is an upstanding public servant, not someone who goes around spreading lies as the plaintiff suggests." Judge Brooks nodded. "Agreed. We'll proceed carefully with this information in mind." Clay struggled to regain control. "Miss Carter, isn't it possible that your training made you intimidating to Miss Whitmore?" Naomi tilted her head. "If by intimidating you mean I refuse to comply with an unreasonable demand for identification in a public park, then no." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Karen was visibly unraveling. The composed, entitled woman who had walked into court believing she would win was now clutching her lawyer's arm, whispering frantically. The narrative had flipped entirely. The woman who tried to paint Naomi as a menace had just learned that Naomi Carter was far more than she could have ever imagined. And she had picked a fight with the wrong person. By the end of the trial, it was clear Karen's case had crumbled. The jury deliberated for only an hour before returning with their decision. On the claims of defamation, emotional distress, and threatening behavior, we find in favor of the defendant, Naomi Carter, the forewoman announced. Furthermore, we deem the plaintiff's case frivolous and recommend that the plaintiff cover all legal fees. Karen's face crumpled. Naomi exhaled in relief. Justice had prevailed. As she walked out of the courthouse, cameras flashing, she simply said, "Let this be a lesson. Public spaces belong to everyone." Karen had tried to ruin Naomi, but in the end, she had only destroyed herself. As Naomi Carter stepped out of the courthouse into the crisp Chicago air, the weight of the past few weeks lifted from her shoulders. The cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but she ignored them. She wasn't here for a spectacle, she was here for justice. And today, she had one. Karen Whitmore, on the other hand, wasn't handling her loss well. Flanked by her lawyer, Clay Harrison, Karen pushed through the crowd with tight, jerky movements. Gone was the arrogant confidence she had worn at the start of the trial. Instead, she looked humiliated, her face a mixture of shock and rage. "Miss Whitmore, do you have a comment on the court's ruling?" a journalist called out. Karen clenched her jaw and kept walking. "Do you regret filing this lawsuit against Naomi Carter?" Karen shot the reporter a furious glare but said nothing. Naomi watched the scene unfold with a quiet sense of satisfaction. "Justice served," Penelope Garcia murmured beside her. Naomi exhaled slowly. "Yeah, but something tells me Karen won't let this go so easily." Penelope smirked. "She won't have a choice. She just lost a lawsuit and her reputation. You, on the other hand, just walked out of this stronger than ever." Naomi gave a small nod, but deep down, she knew that this wasn't over, not really. Karen Whitmore had spent her life feeling untouchable. People like her didn't take losses lightly. News of the trial spread quickly, not just in Chicago but across the country. Entitled Woman Files Bogus Lawsuit, Gets Exposed in Court. CIA officer falsely accused in racial profiling case, plaintiff faces backlash. Karen Whitmore's humiliating defeat, how a baseless lawsuit backfired. Karen had hoped to paint Naomi as a dangerous figure, but instead, she had ruined herself. Her social circle, once filled with well-connected, like-minded acquaintances, began to distance themselves. At her country club, whispers followed her wherever she went. "Did you hear what she did? She actually tried to sue a CIA officer. How stupid can you be? I always knew she had issues, but this? This is next-level embarrassment." Even Marjorie, her closest friend, had stopped returning her calls. Then came the financial blow. Not only was Karen responsible for Naomi's legal fees, but Judge Brooks had also recommended additional sanctions for filing a frivolous lawsuit. She was drowning in legal bills, her reputation in shambles. And as if that weren't bad enough, the home security company her husband co-owned, one of the biggest in the state, was losing clients fast. Turns out, people didn't want to do business with the woman who falsely accused an innocent black woman of being a threat in a public park. The backlash was relentless. Within weeks, Karen was forced to withdraw from her community organizations. By the end of the month, her husband had moved out, and divorce papers were in the works. Karen Whitmore had built her life around power, influence, and control. And now, She had lost everything. Naomi tried to return to normal life. She buried herself in work at the CIA, focusing on national security threats rather than entitled suburban women who had nothing better to do than harass strangers in parks. She kept her head down, avoided unnecessary attention, and maintained a low profile expected of intelligence officers. But the incident with Karen changed something inside her. She had spent years serving her country, protecting its people, yet in her own backyard, she still had to fight for her basic right to exist peacefully. It wasn't something she could ignore. She started speaking at quiet, private events, small gatherings of community leaders, law enforcement officials, and advocacy groups. She couldn't reveal the full extent of her work, but she could use her platform to talk about something just as important: racial bias, abuse of power, and the need for accountability. Jamal, the teenager who had filmed the incident at the park, had reached out again. "You really shook things up," he told her one day when they met for coffee. "People at the skate park are still talking about it. A lot of them saw the video. They get it now." Naomi smiled. "Good. That's what needs to happen. People need to see it. You ever think about going public?" "Like, for real?" he asked. Naomi shook her head. "I have my work. That's where I make the biggest difference." Jamal grinned. "Still, though, you went up against one of the most entitled women in the city and took her down. That's legendary." Naomi chuckled. "Let's just say she picked the wrong person to mess with." Months passed, and Karen Whitmore faded into obscurity. She had tried to fight back against the public backlash, attempted to rebuild her reputation, but the damage was done. Her husband finalized the divorce and moved to another state. Her former friends stopped inviting her to social events. And the last Naomi ever heard, Karen had sold her house and relocated to a quiet, anonymous suburb in another part of the country where no one knew her name. As for Naomi, she continued serving her country, continued making a difference in ways most people would never see. But she never forgot what happened. Because every so often, the world needs a reminder that justice can and does prevail. And this was one of those times. Months turned into a year, and life moved on. But Naomi Carter never forgot the lesson she had learned from her courtroom battle. Despite her high-level training, despite her position as a CIA officer, she had been forced to defend herself in a way she never should have had to. It was a stark reminder that no matter how much she had accomplished, she was still seen as a threat by people like Karen Whitmore. But Naomi refused to let that define her. She threw herself deeper into her work, tackling domestic security threats with the same precision and dedication she always had. But now, she carried something else with her, a renewed sense of purpose. She began mentoring young recruits at the CIA, especially women and people of color, helping them navigate the unique challenges that came with serving in a system that wasn't always built to support them. Outside of work, she continued having quiet but meaningful conversations with community leaders, law enforcement officials, and advocacy groups about racial profiling and systemic bias. She didn't want the spotlight. She just wanted change. Meanwhile, Karen Whitmore's downfall continued. After moving to another state in an attempt to outrun her disgrace, she tried to rebuild her life. But no matter where she went, her reputation followed her. Her name became synonymous with racial profiling lawsuits. Her attempts to join new social circles were met with polite but firm rejections. She tried to launch an online blog, positioning herself as a victim of cancel culture. But the internet was ruthless. Comments flooded in. "You got exactly what you deserved. Imagine losing everything just because you couldn't mind your own business. You messed with a CIA officer and thought you'd win? LOL." Eventually, Karen deleted the blog. She took a low-profile job working remotely, far from the prestigious country clubs and high society gatherings she once thrived in. For the first time in her life, she was truly invisible, and she hated it. One evening, nearly 2 years after the trial, Naomi was in Washington, D.C., attending a private intelligence briefing. She had just stepped out of a high-security government building when she spotted a familiar figure on the sidewalk. Karen Whitmore. Naomi almost didn't recognize her at first. The once meticulously styled woman now looked worn, her hair slightly unkempt, her face tired. She was walking briskly, clutching a cheap handbag, her eyes darting nervously as if expecting someone to recognize her. Naomi could have ignored her, could have let her keep walking, let her pretend she didn't see the woman who had tried to ruin her life. But something made Naomi stop. "Karen." Karen froze mid-step, her breath hitching. Slowly, she turned. The moment her eyes met Naomi's, her face went pale. She looked as if she had seen a ghost. You? Karen whispered, her voice barely audible. Naomi crossed her arms. I see you're still running. Karen swallowed hard. I didn't. I mean, she floundered, searching for words. But for once, she had nothing to say. Naomi studied her, waiting for the arrogance, the self-righteousness, the entitlement. But all she saw was fear. Not fear of Naomi herself. Fear of the consequences of her own actions. You did this to yourself, Naomi said, her voice calm but firm. Karen opened her mouth as if to argue, but then she hesitated. Because deep down, she knew Naomi was right. Without another word, Karen turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowded streets of D.C. Naomi watched her go, then took a deep breath and headed in the opposite direction. She had a mission to complete, a country to protect, a life to live, and she would never waste another second thinking about Karen Whitmore again.